Welcome to my guide on how to build a computer. Now this should apply to any computer, whether it be a gaming computer, a video editing computer, a photo rendering computer, any of those, this should work fine for you. So step one is going to be to prepare your case. Now that may involve removing front panels, top panels, hard drive cages, fans, anything that you don't want in your case or that you need to take off to access things such as fan mounts in the top and front of your case. So I'm going to go ahead, and because this case is a metal finish which attracts fingerprints very easily, I'm going to wear a pair of gloves for this. If you've got a plastic case then you should be fine. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off the front panel and the top panel first. I've already gone ahead and taken off the side panels, but that should be fairly straightforward. So for this case it's just a simple case of pulling it up and they pop off. So these panels have a lot of soundproofing on the inside, which makes this case a silent case. So you just want to put those over to one side where they're not going to get damaged. So now that we've got those out, we can flip it over onto its back. And I'm going to be removing these hard drive cages. So in this case, which is the NZXT H630, it's just a case of 4 thumb screws per hard drive cage. I can now go ahead and take off the gloves. So you just remove these thumb screws, but from the factory they are a bit tight, so I'm going to be using a screwdriver. All you really need, tools wise, to build a computer is a Phillips head screwdriver, maybe an Allen key, and maybe a flathead screwdriver, but pretty much Phillips head screwdriver should see you through. So there you go, they drop out. You can just lift the case off them. So we have 2 hard drive cages. We'll just set them over to one side, seeing as I only have 3 mechanical hard drives in here. Well, 2 to start with, but there will be a third coming. I don't need all 8 hard drive bays. So now they've done that, the next stage is going to be to remove fans, seeing as I've got new fans to replace the stock ones. So there's a 200mm fan in the front here, and there's a 140 in the back. I've got some Corsair AF and SP 120 and 140mm fans, which I will be replacing these with. So I'll have 2 140s in the front, 2 120 in the bottom, 2 120s in the top, and a 140 in the back. There'll all be AF fans apart from the 2 in the top, which are going to go on the H100i, and there'll be the SP versions. So now that we've removed all of the fans, the case is now ready to work in. But to make life easier for us, we're going to start by assembling the motherboard outside of the case so that we have more room to work. So go ahead and put the case to one side. So at this point you're going to want to go ahead and grab your CPU, your RAM and your motherboard. So in this case we're using the i7-3930K processor. This is a 2011 socket CPU, which is why we're using a 2011 socket motherboard. And then we've got 32GB of Corsair Vengeance Pro RAM. So we're going to want to go ahead and take this lot out of their boxes. Just cut the seals. So there's 2 16GB kits, making a total of 32. As I said, this is a video editing PC, so obviously we've got a lot higher grade components than you would do in a typical gaming PC. Well, it's video editing and photo editing all in one really. So we have our 32GB of RAM. For gaming you'd probably want no more than about, I'd say 16 max really. So yeah, there's the RAM. Go ahead and get this one out. CPU, this is the 3930K. It's the second best sort of non-Xeon processor from Intel. So it's very high end. It's got 6 cores. With hyper-threading you've got effectively 12 cores in here, which is great for programs such as Photoshop and Premiere Pro, After Effects, that sort of thing. Go ahead and get the CPU out of there. terms of actual size, the 2011 CPUs are quite a bit bigger than the 1155, 1156 and 1150 CPUs, so that might be a noticeable difference. Going to the motherboard here, don't want any of this, we just want the IO shield. We're not doing SLI or Crossfire, so we don't need any of that. And I want to come down to this bottom compartment and get the motherboard out. So we have our motherboard, our RAM. Don't need this just yet, that'll come in handy when we are plugging it into the case. And then there's also our CPU. You're going to make sure you remove the plastic protective cover, otherwise obviously your CPU won't fit. You want to keep hold of it because you do need it if you want to RMA your motherboard further down the line if it breaks. And it's also good to have if you want to sell it. So with the CPU, with Intel there are 2 notches, one there, which line up with 2 notches on the socket, which are there and there. You don't want to touch any of the pins on the motherboard itself, as the oils on your finger can damage it. You should also be able to line it up with a triangle. So we've got a triangle on this corner. Also got a triangle on that corner, which tells us that we want to go this way round. And you just want to hold it by the side like this. Don't touch the metal on the top or the pins on the bottom. Actually, it's contacts on an Intel. So we'll go ahead and just drop it into place like so. Don't force it, don't press it down, anything like that. You just go ahead and close this back up again. So we'll get this side in first, which will then allow you to get this side in. If you do it the other way around, then this one won't fit past that little bit of metal there. So once you've got the CPU installed, you can go ahead and install your RAM. So as we've got 4 sticks here and only 4 slots on the motherboard, obviously we're going to fill them all. If you're not filling them all, then there should say in your motherboard manual which slots to fill. So for example on here it says DDR3, 2, 4, 1 and 3, and in your motherboard manual it'll say fill slots 1 and 2 first or something like that. With 2011 usually you'd have 8 slots on the motherboard. This is a slightly smaller motherboard, so you don't get all 8 slots. You make sure that the switches are open. That way you can actually get your RAM in. And then on the RAM there is a little notch there. And there's also a notch on the RAM slot itself, and you just line those up and slot it in place. Give it a good push and you should see both ends click up. I'm just going to go ahead and install all of those. Again, checking the slot. You do have to press quite hard on this. It does feel like you might break something, but don't worry, you won't. So on this side, the slot's at the other end. So just rotate the RAM stick. You can always check that the stops at the end have flicked up. If they have, then you know that your RAM is seated correctly. It's always good just to check, give them all a quick push, just to check they're all seated correctly. So that's step 2 completely done. We've installed everything onto our motherboard. The next step is going to be back it into the case. So now would be a good time to install some fans. Obviously if you're not using your own aftermarket fans, then obviously you don't need to do that and you can just go ahead and use the stock ones, but they will be louder and not necessarily perform quite as well as ones that you buy aftermarket. So these are Corsairs AF 140, 120 and SP 120s. So obviously 140mm fans and 120mm fans. The benefit of having 140 is at a slower RPM, it will still produce just as much airflow as a 120mm at a faster RPM due to the increased size. So we're going to have these on the front, and with a fan, sometimes they'll have airflow indicators. So yeah, here we've got an arrow down and an arrow across, so the airflow comes in that way and the fan spins in that direction. But it's fairly simple. this side with the nice looking side, not with the fan motor support. This side is where the air comes in, and with the motor support is where it comes out. So Corsair's Air series of fans all have this rubber grommet in the corners between the plastic and the case, which will help reduce vibrations. You also want to be wary of where the wire is going to come out to make cable management easier for you. So in this case we probably want to install it this way round. And there's mounts in the front here for 2 140s, 3 120s, or 2 200mm fans. I could have gone with 2 200mm fans, but there aren't that many great 200mm fans on the market at the moment, as they're still not that common. So I would rather go with 140mm fans that I know are going to be quiet and good performance, rather than going with the 200mm versions. So this case supports natively 2 200mm fans in the top and the front, which is, I think, a first. I'm not sure, well, it's in a mid-tower case as well, which is pretty impressive. I'm not sure if the 600T supports that, but it may well do. So to access the fan mounts on the bottom, we need to remove the fan filter from the bottom. Nice removal one, nice fine mesh on there. So that's going to be nice and easy to clean. So we want a nice clean case. So then we just go ahead and flip the case upside down. Now have access to these two mounts here. So on the bottom here we're using Corsair AF 120s. They do have 140mm mounts on the bottom here, but as you can see, the cutout doesn't go any further than the 120mm fan. So it's not worth putting in a 140mm fan. They cost a bit more, so even on a build like this you want to save money where you can. So you can use 120mm fans in the bottom here. Okay, now at the completed stage 3 of installing the fans, I've left out the 2 in the top, which are going to be on the radiator, until later when we come to installing the radiator. We can move on to stage 4, which is going to be to install the power supply. Now you can mix these orders up a little bit depending on your personal preference, whatever. But generally you want to get the power supply in and all the cables in first before you start putting in too much hardware, otherwise you can find that it's tricky to get particular cables in. Let's remove that sticker. You can have the power supply either way up as long as your case has ventilation on the bottom, but I'm going to go with the fan on top, and it'll act as an exhaust for the case. So we just need to go ahead and install the screws which come with the power supply, if I can find where I left them. So the power supply needs 4 screws, which will come with the power supply usually, and they just go in the back. And most cases have, well, as long as they support fan down mounting, then they will have screw holes for both. So you just go ahead and screw them in on the back. So now we've got the screws installed, you can go ahead and, if it's a modular power supply such as this one, you can start to plug in cables. If it's not modular, then obviously they'll already be there. And you can go ahead and route them behind the motherboard tray. And for example, in this case we have rubber grommets which we can pass them through. Just make sure that you get the right end of the cable on the power supply. So once you've got the power supply end plugged in, you can just pass it through the hole in the tray, and then you'll be good to go with routing it around the back later on. An important one to get in first is the 8-pin CPU, which comes out the top here, because it can be very tricky to route that one if you've already got the motherboard installed. So you'll want to go ahead and get that one in first. So it's a good idea with the modular power supply to think out which cables you're going to need. So you know, if you've got a graphics card, you're going to need some 6+2 pin cables. Sometimes you'll get 2 connectors on one cable, sometimes, such as this one, it'll just be a single connector. And you need to work out you know, how many hard drives you're going to plug in, where the hard drives are going to be. For example, if you've got SSDs over here, hard drives here, DVD drive up here, you may need 3 separate cables to reach the different locations. So that's an important consideration. So once you've got all those cables installed, you want to flip the case over very carefully, and then you can start to wrap the different cables around. For example, I know that there's one SATA cable that's going to go to these 2 drives here. There's another one that's going to go to the SSDs down here. And there's another one that's going to go to the hard drives up here. We have the 8-pin CPU power, which is going to come around the top here. So you've got the 24-pin, which is the main power for your motherboard, and that will most likely go through here. Tends to be in the same position on every motherboard, so it's a pretty good bet that it's going to go through that middle slot. We've got our 2 graphics card cables, which are going to go through the slot below. And then we've got our Molex, which is just going to hang around the back here. So stage 4.5, if you like, is going to be to install peripherals, so whether it be DVD drives or fan controllers, reservoirs, I guess, if you're doing a water cooling loop, but we're not going to go into that in this video. So I have a fan controller here, which I'm going to go ahead and install. Just go ahead and slide into the 5¼ bays. This is a quick release mechanism, so you just pop that up and it just slides in place. And then you can just pop that back down. But because this is only half length, it doesn't actually do anything, so we're going to need to pop some screws in there. Okay, so stage 5 is going to be to install the motherboard. First step of that is going to be to install the I/O shield. Just want to make sure that the audio ports are at the bottom, and then you just pop it in at the back. So once that's in, making sure that your cables are all correctly positioned, the ones going behind the motherboard, and you want to slide it in place. Like so. In this case, all the standoffs are already installed for us, so we don't need to do any of that. So now that you've got your screws, you can go ahead and start to screw some of them in. You probably want to start with this middle one here, as that will then hold it in place for you to get the others in. You don't want to tighten them fully to start with, because you may need to move the motherboard around ever so slightly to get some of them in. For example, these top ones here. Okay, now you can start to plug some cables into the motherboard. You'll want to refer to your motherboard manual as to the position of the front panel connectors. So they'll be different for every motherboard, so you want to check the manual for that. Okay, it's now time to install the SSDs, if you have any. In this case, they're on the back of the motherboard tray. I've already installed 3 here, but that was something a little bit custom, so I didn't show you how to do that. But these just have some trays which you then screw the SSD into. So we get them out of their packets. It's just 2 thumb screws. And you slide those off. And then you just screw the SSD in with those 4 screws and then slide them back on. So I'll go ahead, screw them in, and I'll be back in a second. So now that we've got the trays screwed on, we can just slide these back into place. So now it is time to install your cooler. I would recommend reading the manual that comes with your cooler, as there are lots of different mounting methods. This is 2011, but for example, if I was using AMD or 1155, 1150, 1156, anything like that, then the procedure will be completely different. So I am going to go ahead and mount the radiator in the top. So the fans will be below the radiator, So you just use some short screws to attach the radiator to the case, and then some longer screws through the fans into the radiator. So once we've installed all of those, we can go ahead and install the fans on the bottom, making sure that they're pushing the air in the right direction. So we want this to exhaust, so we want to make sure that this side of the fan is on the bottom. Also being careful where we place our cables, so they're easy to cable manage. Now I've got the radiator in, it's time to get the CPU block on. But first, before we do that, we need to get these standoffs in place for the 2011 one. And there's just a bracket which goes over the top to secure it down. So this will vary depending on your cooler, depending whether you're using an all-in-one, whether you're using a air cooler. So always best to read the manual just to make sure that you're doing it right, because you don't want to fry your CPU, especially on something like a 2011 CPU, because they are very expensive. Now I want to remove this plastic cover covering the thermal compound. Work that into place and get the bracket over. Move all cables out of the way and then place the bracket over the standoffs, making sure you hold it in place. And just starting using hands only, you can get these screws on, caps or whatever you want to call them. Thumb screws, I guess. You want to do it in a cross pattern so that you don't get it tighter on one side than the other. And then you can go around and start to tighten them. Once that's in, all that's left to do is plug in some cables. So with an all-in-one cooler like this, or any cooler really, you want to plug this into the CPU fan header on your motherboard. That way your motherboard will be able to control it, and it will know that it is the CPU, so make sure that it's very cool, or the coolest possible. And then with the H100i, they actually have a SATA power. Normally with an all-in-one you'd find a Molex, but good to see that they're moving on. It's easy just having to have one whole chain of Molex just for this one power, whereas you're bound to have SATA power in there anyway. Next up, or finally, we need to install the graphics card. So first work out firstly how many PCI slots it's going to take up in the back, and then work out which ones. Usually it's the second and third one, but in this case we've actually got a slot quite high on the motherboard, which is 16X, which is what we want. So we'll be using that, just the top two. And obviously if you have more than one graphics card, you need to take out quite a few. So taking those out, just pop that switch, get your graphics card, so GTX 780, very nice card. And then you just need to slide it into the slot. There you go, it clicks in place. Get those thumb screws which are holding in the PCI brackets and reinstall them. And then get your 6+2 pins or 8 pin or whatever cables from the power supply from earlier, which I've just twisted up there, and plug them in. So on this particular card we have an 8 pin and a 6 pin. There's the 8 pin in. and there's the 6-pin in. And then probably just pop a cable tie on there just to keep those nicely held together.